The countdown was no longer a sequence of digits. It had become a physical vibration in the soles of Santos's boots, a rhythmic thrumming that felt like the heartbeat of a dying star. His finger hovered over the physical toggle of the weapons console, a jagged piece of industrial steel that felt colder than the vacuum outside the hull. On the primary display, the arming sequence for the core detonator flickered from a violent red to a deceptive amber for the third time in 60 seconds. The bridge of the black horizon was a tomb of held breaths, where the only movement was the flickering of warning lights reflecting off Santos's steady eyes. Would you have held the line when the stars themselves turned against you? Or would you have surrendered to the cold silence? Because Santos understood that some debts are only paid in kinetic energy. That exact smell of scorched ozone. It was a sensory ghost that had haunted Santos for 22 days, ever since he stood in the High Council's inner sanctum and watched the magnetic fields of the Galvathi representatives invert in a coordinated display of political disgust. Back then, the air had been thick with the scent of expensive incense and the arrogance of species who believed they had finally solved the human problem. The betrayal had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic violence. In a single session, 3 centuries of treaties were dissolved under the guise of galactic stability. The Council had used Earth's own defensive data, shared in good faith for the sake of collective security, to map every blind spot in the Sol system's sensor grid. They didn't use bombs. They used signatures and subclauses to strip Earth's borders of their teeth. Beneath the observation deck's grating, something shifted. It was a faint, rhythmic rattle, the sound of a loose ventilation cover that Jace had been meaning to fix for months. To anyone else, it was a nuisance, but to Santos, it was the only thing that sounded real in a universe of lies. It was a mundane reminder that while empires built monuments to their own greatness, humans were still just people trying to keep their machines from falling apart. When the news of the Council's decree reached Earth, the expected reaction was a frantic diplomatic plea or a desperate mobilization of the remaining local fleets. Instead, Earth went dark. No broadcasts, no angry rebuttals, no signals at all. To the Council, this silence was a victory. They celebrated in the high spires of the core worlds, convinced that the humans had finally accepted their place as a legacy species, destined to fade into the background of history. Which meant the Council's military academies had failed to study the one subject humans had mastered over 1,000 bloody wars: the institutionalization of failure. In most galactic cultures, defeat was a stain to be erased or a shame to be hidden. But in the hushed halls of West Point and Sandhurst, defeat was a curriculum. Human commanders spent years dissecting their own collapses, turning every lost battle into a blueprint for the next victory. They didn't just learn from failure. They built their entire strategic philosophy upon the wreckage of what went wrong. As the Council populace drank to their new era of dominance, a single shadow began to move through the gravity wells of the 12 core worlds. It wasn't a fleet, not yet. It was a whisper in the dark, a series of unexplainable sensor ghosts that the automated defense grids dismissed as solar flares. Nizer, a senior scribe for the Council, was the first to notice the pattern. His own internal magnetic field began to repel the metallic desk in front of him, a biological reaction to the sudden shift in local gravitational pressure. He watched his terminal as a hidden fleet signature, the Black Horizon and its sister ships, began to bleed through the stealth shielding. Because Mercy, as it turns out, has a very specific expiration date. The panic didn't start with a scream. It started with a low, grinding hum that resonated through the floor of the Council chambers. The humans weren't at the borders. They weren't hitting the outposts. They were sitting directly above the Capitol, their hulls gleaming with a matte black finish that seemed to swallow the light of the nearby sun. Santos sat in his command chair, his face a mask of weary resolve. He wasn't looking at the massive planetary defense platforms that were now scrambling to lock onto him. He was looking at the fingerprint smudge on the confirm button of his console, a tiny oily smear that represented the last human touch before the world changed. The Council's primary defense grid roared to life, but as the targeting lasers swept across the human ships, the codes didn't bite. The screens on the Black Horizon began to scroll through the Council's own encryption keys. It was a digital mirror, reflecting the Council's betrayal back at them with terrifying precision. "They are hailing us," the communications officer whispered. Santos didn't answer immediately. He reached out and tapped the arming toggle again, disarming the sequence for the second time. The counter reset. The tension on the bridge didn't break. It merely stretched thinner, like a wire pulled to the point of snapping. He could see the Galvathi ships on his long-range scanners, their fields flickering in a frantic attempt to find a purchase in the warped space around the black horizon. A hollow, three-tone chime, then dead air. The first message from the Council was a demand for immediate withdrawal, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control. Santos listened to the translated voice, its tone shifting from arrogance to a thin, reedy fear that made his jaw tighten. The Council's response was a frantic cascade of digital signatures, a desperate attempt to re-engage the very defense grid they had spent a century perfecting. But the architecture of a trap, once it's sprung, leaves no room for debate. Nizer, watching from the scribe station, felt his magnetic secondary heart skip a beat as the human fleet's presence began to distort the local sensor reality. It wasn't just that they were there. It was how they were there. Commander Santos, the High Adjudicator's voice crackled through the bridge speakers of the Black Horizon, stripped of its usual melodic resonance. You are firing upon a peaceful diplomatic corps. The human colonies you left behind. The massacre your people suffered on Kalo for. Is that not enough blood? Santos didn't look up from the console. He was focused on a single fraying thread on his left uniform cuff, a tiny imperfection in the fabric that seemed more important than the shouting of an empire. It was a mundane loose end, a physical reminder of the wear and tear of a life spent in the shadows of giants. While the Galvathi ships struggled to maintain their magnetic cohesion against the artificial gravity wells the Black Horizon had deployed, the human fleet sat motionless, a collection of silent predators that had turned the Council's own planetary defense grid into a cage of their own making. Kalo 4 was empty, Santos said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely registered on the comms. We evacuated the civilian population 3 months ago. You didn't bombard a colony. You bombarded bait. Gravity never forgets. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating pressure that filled the Council chambers and the human bridge alike. Nizer felt the shift first. The magnetic fields of his superiors began to collapse into chaotic patterns, a physical manifestation of the realization that their grand political maneuver had been anticipated before it was even conceived. The humans hadn't just studied their own failures. They had studied the Council's predictable greed. Santos leaned forward. The smudge of fingerprint oil on the confirm button was still there, a dull mark against the cold, brushed metal. He had disarmed the sequence twice already. He had given them the first chance when they began their political betrayal. He had given them the second when Earth went silent. Now, the third arming was the only truth left. The Black Horizon sensors showed the Council's defense grid turning inward. The massive laser arrays, designed to protect the core worlds, were now locked onto the Council's own administrative spires. It was a perfect, kinetic irony. The humans hadn't brought enough firepower to destroy a sector. They didn't need to. They had simply taken the keys to the Council's own house and changed the locks. We don't destroy civilizations, Santos whispered into the open channel, his eyes fixed on the fraying thread of his sleeve. We give them the choice to destroy themselves. The choice was theirs. The time for granular breathing had passed. The countdown on the console reached its final, heavy zero for the third time in a single minute. This time, Santos didn't reach for the disarm. He watched the light turn from a warning amber to a final, absolute violet. Suddenly, the Council's digital screams were silenced by a hardline override. The Black Horizon didn't fire a single shot. Instead, it sent a packet of data, the complete logs of the Council's betrayal, their map sensor holes, and the proof of the Kalo 4 bait to every minor species in the galaxy. The massacre the Council had hoped to blame on human aggression was now exposed as a failed, cold-blooded execution of an empty world. The political illusion didn't just break. It evaporated. The 12 core worlds were no longer the center of a galactic empire. They were targets of their own defense grid, held hostage by the very protocols they had used to strip Earth of its dignity. Santos stood up, his hand finally dropping from the console. The vibration in his boots had stopped. The ship felt different now, no longer a weapon, but a witness. He looked out at the burning lights of the capital below, where panic was finally turning into a terrifying, motionless realization. The humans had institutionalized failure, yes, but they had also perfected the art of the return. The new order wasn't established with a treaty or a signature. It was established in the silence that followed the human withdrawal. As the black horizon turned back toward the dark, the council sat in the shadow of their own weapons, realizing that you cannot manipulate a predator that has already counted the cost of the trap. Nizer stood perfectly still at his station, his magnetic field finally settling into a low, stable hum. He didn't look at the tactical displays. He looked at the empty space where the human ships had been, a void that held more weight than the entire council treasury. He understood now. The arming sequence hadn't been a glitch or a threat. It had been a heartbeat. The toggle on the console sat cold and silent, the violet light extinguished. On the glass of the nearby water bulb, a single bead of condensation finally grew too heavy and rolled down the side, leaving a clear trail through the dust. The bridge was empty of everything but the soft, rhythmic rattle of the ventilation cover, steady and unyielding.